Things are happening to the brothers. Simeon has to stay behind. He wants them to bring Benjamin down. And their exact words in Genesis 42 is, we're being repaid for what we did. It's catching up with us. And so they understood this idea of retribution. It was a common experience. We know that there was a separation because they couldn't even face Joseph. In verse 16 it says, so they sent this message. They didn't go and tell him. They sent somebody there to tell him, hey, listen, this is what your dad said. You know, in light of that, this is what we want you to do. Do you know why they sent an emissary? Why they sent a message? They didn't know how he was going to respond. If he was going to respond in anger, better let this guy take the brunt of the anger, and it will come along a little bit later once he's exercised that anger. They didn't know, and so they were afraid to face him. Now, some might say it might have been Benjamin that they sent. Honestly, it makes sense. He was his brother from, the only brother, really, other brother from Rachel. So he was his blood brother, and you could tell whenever they got reunited at the end of this story that they still had a great love for each other, and there was a great bond between them. So it would make sense, but honestly, it doesn't matter who it was, because the simple fact is they couldn't face their brother themselves. They had to send somebody else. The other thing I want us to catch in this, and I didn't catch this until I honestly was reading through this account from Genesis 37 to the end, just kind of over and over trying to understand what had happened. Time didn't change how they felt. Now think about this. We're told time heals what? All wounds. Does it seem like it was the case here? Well, let's take a look at this. In Genesis 37, if you were to try to put together a timeline of Joseph's life, in Genesis chapter 37, we are specifically told that Joseph was 17 years old. When we start seeing him, he's 17. We know that he tattles on his brothers. We know that he's having dreams. We know that right after we're told that he's 17, that he's sent to check on his brothers and that his brothers throw him in a pit. The next time we have any reference to age, he's 30 and he's in Egypt and he's just been exalted by Pharaoh and put in charge. Now, we also know that at that time, the reason he was put in charge was the simple fact that God had given them, the ability to interpret dreams. And Pharaoh had had his very disturbing dreams, which we come to realize after Joseph interprets them, means that there is a famine coming. There will be 7 years of plenty of harvest like nobody's ever seen, and there'll be 7 years of famine like nobody has ever seen. And Joseph goes as far as to tell Pharaoh that you've had this dream 2 times. It's going to happen. And it's very safe bet they had already started into the 7 years of feast. So if we add 7 to the 30, just for the 7 years of good provision, of good farming, he was 37 when the famine started. When he encounters his brothers, he tells them, after he spills the beans and says who he is, that 2 years of famine have gone by. There are still 5 left. 37 plus 2 is 39. Now, if we assume that they had the ability to get back to the land of Canaan, to get Jacob and the rest of the family, and come immediately back down, we can figure out how old he was in this story, because we're told that Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years. 39 plus 17 is going to give us 56. Now, let's think about this. First age, we're told, is 17. If we assume that all of those things happened at the age of 17, that's almost 40 years that the brothers have had to think about what they had done. If we assume that it all happened at the age of 30, that it was just bam, 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 thrown into the pit, sold into slavery, taken to Potiphar, then into jail at age 30, you're still looking at almost a quarter of a century to sit and be terrorized by your guilt. Because time does not heal all wounds. I don't know that there's any variation of that you can genuinely say, unless you add God into that equation. So time didn't change it. They held on to this. We know, as I mentioned earlier, that the brothers had said in Genesis 42, verses 21 and 22, when they were facing the trials by Joseph, we're being repaid. So they knew this was something that they had thought about. So not only was there a separation, not only they couldn't face him, but it couldn't be ignored. You see, they could no longer hide behind Jacob. In verse 15, when it says, when Joseph's brothers saw that their brother's father was dead, they didn't just realize he was dead at this time. There had been a great mourning time for Jacob, both in the land of Egypt and when he went back to Canaan. What this means is when they realized that they couldn't hide behind their dad anymore, they honestly probably thought that Joseph had never exacted revenge just because the dad was alive and he didn't want to make dad upset. But once Jacob was gone, hey, who knows what's going to happen, okay? So they could no longer hide behind Jacob, although they still very wisely tried to use Jacob when they sent this message to Joseph. Now, there's no record of whether this message really was sent. I doubt whether Jacob really said this, but it is something he could have said. It is something that a father who loved his children and who loved God would want their children to be reconciled. But I think if he had said this, number one, I think he would have said it to Joseph personally. And I think before this, when he's given the blessings to the sons, he didn't neglect mention the sin of Reuben. He didn't neglect mention this anger and wrath of Simeon and Levi. I think he would have brought it out if it was an issue at that time. So whether or not he said it or not, Joseph took it for what it was and probably thought that his dad really did. And it was certainly something that Jacob could have said. So they couldn't hide behind Jacob anymore. So what did they do? I think they got serious. You see, they admitted the depth of their sin. In verse 17, we see 3 different descriptions of evil. And I've read that there's only 4 really different words used in the Old Testament for sin. And that this is the only passage where 3 of those 4 terms are used to describe sin. You see, these gentlemen understood how much their relationship had been destroyed. They understood the depth of destruction that they had wrought and how bad things had truly been. In other words, this wasn't, hey, you know that lie? I'm sorry about that. That's horrible. Every vile term that they could describe it, they used it. They understood the depth of what they had done. Not only did they admit the depth of their sin, in verse 17 and 18, we see that they humbled themselves. After they had duly noted all of their crimes, you notice a downward progression of their status. In verse 17, verse 17, it says, say this to Joseph, please forgive, notice this, your brother's transgression. And then when we go on again, please forgive the transgression of the servants of God. No longer brothers, still maybe equals, still servants of God. Now, notice what comes up next at 18 when the brothers show up on the scene. The brothers came to him, bowed down before him, and said, we are your what? Your slaves. They did not approach Joseph on equal terms. They did not approach Joseph as, I would approach my own brother or my own wife or my own father. Hey, I'm a human being, you're a human being, we're both loved by God. They understood just how low they had fallen by what they had done. And when they walked in, you don't just say, we are your slaves. They honestly, genuinely meant what they were saying and were willing to be that for Joseph. They approached him not as equals, but as subordinates, demonstrating that they had sincere remorse. Not only did they humble themselves, they used what was true of Joseph to appeal for forgiveness. They used his position. You see, they didn't approach Joseph just as somebody on the street. They understood who he was. They understood that he was the only person that Pharaoh would turn to. Pharaoh was the only person who was above him. When they approached him as a king. They approached him as someone who had authority over their lives. They also approached him as someone who had loyalty to their father. They used their father to gain forgiveness. And it worked. But not only did they use loyalty, they used his religion. They used his relationship with God as they referred to the God of Jacob, as they referred to the God of your father. And they used what was true of Joseph to gain forgiveness. The really sad part in all of this is the simple fact that forgiveness had already been offered. You see, in chapter 45, Joseph had said almost exactly verbatim the same thing that he said here. When he spilled the beans, he spoke words of kindness to them. He spoke words of comfort. He said, what you planned for evil, listen, God, he took care of this. He planned it for good. It turned out good. Now, we don't necessarily see explicit words of forgiveness, but I don't think you're going to say something like that if you still harbor bitterness in your heart. So he had already offered it, but they missed it. And because they missed it, they had spent decades, haunted by their guilt and trapped by fear of what their brother could do. Now let's shift gears for just a second and take a look at Joseph's response. After they had sent their message to Joseph, what did Joseph do? What was his response? Did he write a letter back? He wept. This wasn't tears that just, the man tears where you have one or two that come down when you're touched in a service, but you don't dare let any more because somebody might say something. He wept. Now, the obvious question is, why did he weep? Number of different reasons can be offered, and they all probably have a part to play in it. He could have been upset because the estrangement between his brothers wasn't fully healed. I mean, think, decades, and they still had this that they were worried about. He might have wondered why his dad didn't fully trust him or why they even were afraid of him. He might have wept because they felt they needed an intermediary. Maybe because they thought he was capable of holding a grudge like they held against him. Maybe because he could hear his father's voice. The funeral hadn't been that long. He could probably still very clearly picture his father and still hear the things that his fathers would say. But I think probably the one that takes the cake, the one that explains it all, I think the reason he wept is that he realized that all those years ago when his brothers first came, they completely missed the testimony. They completely missed the forgiveness. They completely missed and overlooked all that had been offered to them and had lived all of these years underneath this tyranny of guilt. Now, whatever the reason ended up being, we see clearly that Joseph had no grudge. He was on the other end of the spectrum when we see that he wept. Now, we need to ask ourselves, how did he get to this point? How was he able to weep? Any one of us in his position, and I know I would have, just because I know how, in my testimony, how I reacted to God over the birth defect of my son. Any one of us could have been bitter and would have been bitter and would have taken revenge the first time that we had opportunity. So how did he get past that? I think, number one, he recognized God's position in all of this. In verse 19, it says, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?'" Now, I think he recognized a couple of things when he said that. I think, number one, he realized that God was the one who was in charge of dealing out retribution. You can read, and I'll give these just for your personal use, Leviticus 19, verse 18, Deuteronomy 32, verse 35, Romans chapter 12, verse 19, and there's many others, but we see in those verses that God is in charge of retribution. He is in place of that. It is his place to exact that, not ours. But I think he understood something else along with that. He understood that God was still in control, that God was still sovereign. He knew the beginning, he knew the end, and he knew everything that was going on in the middle, and that he didn't forget, he didn't neglect, he didn't leave them alone. Instead, he stayed intimately involved. And that leads me to the next thing I think he recognized, not just God's position, but he recognized God's providence. Now, what I mean by providence is this. Oftentimes when we speak of God's sovereignty. And God is a sovereign God. He does not depend on us for what's going to happen in the sense of deciding how everything needed to come